recording.
Right. Today is September the 27th. It is 4 o'clock and this is the work session of the Planning Commission. So let's make sure everyone's in the right spot. Welcome, welcome, welcome. The opportunities for the public to access and participate in the hybrid meeting are posted on the Albemarle County website on the Planning Commission homepage and on the Albemarle County calendar. Participation will include the opportunity to comment on those matters for which comments from the public will be received. So we have called the meeting to order, and I will ask our clerk just to call the roll so we can establish a quorum.
Okay, Mr. Claiborne,
Present.
Mr. Missile,
Here.
Mr. Carazana,
Here.
Mr. Bivens,
Here.
and Mr. Murray.
Here.
And Ms. Firehawk is not there.
That's correct.
Thank you.
All right. All right, thank you. The next item is other matters not listed on the agenda from the public. Are there any matters from the public that are not listed here that anyone would like to speak to? No, I see head nods, and I don't believe there's anyone online. So with that, we'll begin, roll up our sleeves and get ready for the work session. CPA 2021-00002 AC 44 Growth Management Policy. So with that, I'll turn it over to our staff.
Right. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tori Kanelopoulos. I'm a senior planner in the county's planning department and joined today by Vlad Gavrilovic, principal planner at EPRPC. And today we have a work session on the framework for an equitable and resilient community as part of the AC 44 process. So this is an overview of the agenda for today. We'll start with where we are in phase 1 and how we'll move into phase 2. Give a quick update on the land use build out report. Give an overview of how we got to the 4 big ideas and the community input we heard on those. And then share the draft framework for an equitable and resilient community. So we'll share a purpose of the framework, an overview of the content, and how the framework relates to the current comp plan. We'll share next steps and a quick overview of phase 2, and then have time for planning commission discussion and questions. This is just an overview of the engagement that we've had since the July Planning Commission work session, where we talked about common themes from the potential growth management options. We've held 4 roundtables with the community to talk about the big ideas. 2 of those were in person and 2 of those were virtual. We also had a corresponding online questionnaire that was available, and we had 2 working group meetings. This graphic shows an overview of AC 44 phase 1 with a blue circle to indicate where we are now. And there are 3 main steps in phase 1. In the first step, we shared a local history of growth management, an overview of the current growth management policy, and initial findings from the land use build out report. We asked for community input on the current policy and what should be prioritized when reviewing the policy. In the second step, we developed potential growth management options to consider while reviewing the policy. And we received significant community input on these options and heard community interest in expanding the conversation beyond just a growth management policy. Based on the input we received, we developed several common themes, which we shared at the previous work session. In the third step, these common themes were refined and developed into big ideas. And we asked for community input on the big ideas, which were then developed into the framework for an equitable and resilient community. Throughout the AC 44 process, we are using 2 main lenses to guide our work, which are equity and climate action. In 2019, the Board of Supervisors adopted a resolution in support of an equitable and inclusive community. Additionally, the board has identified climate action as a top priority and adopted the county's climate action plan in 2020. Therefore, the framework prioritizes equity and climate action and resilience as key principles to guide our policies. Additionally, the framework was developed based on the input from community members, the AC 44 working group, and the Planning Commission, as well as a review of goals in the current comprehensive plan and research of best practices. So the next steps in phase 1 are to share the draft framework and the Planning Commission feedback with the Board of Supervisors at an October 19th work session and ask for their input. And then based on Planning Commission and board feedback, finalize the framework. Then in phase two, we would look at existing conditions, trends, and challenges and opportunities for each main topic, which would be things like transportation, housing, and natural resources. We would develop policies for each topic and use this framework to guide the work, and then also use the framework to guide the structure of the plan. And as we move toward the end of phase one, we are also wrapping up the land use build out, which we shared a draft of with the Planning Commission in May of this year. And as a reminder, the purpose of the build out is to understand the maximum theoretical build out potential based on land use designations of our current development areas and consider if the maximum potential build out is sufficient to accommodate projected growth and demand in the next 20 years. So some key takeaways were that there appears to be sufficient land, looking at land use designations available for both residential and non-residential growth and demand in the development areas, but that it is predicated on a number of assumptions, including development at the higher end of recommended ranges and significant redevelopment and infill. We looked at rezoning approvals between 2016 through 2021 and found that many were not approved at the higher end of recommended ranges, and found the total number of units approved was about 58% of the maximum units recommended in the comprehensive plan. And looked at lower end of recommended density ranges and found those did not appear to be sufficient to accommodate future growth and demand. And while there also appears to be sufficient capacity for non-residential uses, the list of potential properties that could be developed is much smaller when factoring in certain size and infrastructure criteria, especially for office and industrial uses. So we also looked at 3 potential scenarios for the residential build out, and the first is the main focus of the report. So that's the theoretical maximum land use build out and an unadjusted pipeline. So that would assume development at the highest ends of density ranges, such as 34 units an acre for urban density residential. And then in the second scenario, we used that 58% figure of total units approved through rezonings to adjust the maximum land use build out down by 58%. Then we also adjusted the pipeline based on the average units at build out and subtracted 1,000 units from Old Trail Village, which is expected to build out much lower than its total approval. And then in the third scenario, we used zoning districts for each property that could develop or redevelop instead of land use designations, and then also adjusted the pipeline as we did in scenario 2. And so while for each scenario, the total potential build out is still higher than the forecasted demand, there are a number of constraining factors that will further limit actual build out. So as we move into phase 2, we can continue to refer back to the land use build out and can use the framework to provide more guidance for policies related to the land use build out, including land use, housing, and economic development. So now we'll move into the big ideas. And just a quick refresher on how we got there. As we shared earlier in the presentation, we used the community input heard during steps 1 and 2 of this phase, equity and climate action lenses, planning commission input, goals in the current comprehensive plan, and best practices and research of other localities. At the 4 community roundtables, we asked community members to share input on the big ideas, including, do the big ideas reflect your vision of our community in 20 years? Do they guide us toward a more equitable and resilient community? And what's missing? So in these slides, we've summarized the feedback that we heard at the roundtables. On housing affordability and accessibility, we heard there's a need for housing that is affordable to people employed in Albemarle County who also want to live here. Community members should be able to age in place and have housing accessible to all abilities. Housing needs the infrastructure to support it. And there's a concern that many community members who want to live in Albemarle County continue to move away and are unable to afford to stay or return to the county. On workforce development and training opportunities, we heard that we need opportunities for local residents and for a variety of career ladder jobs, that we should continue to partner with schools, colleges, and universities in our area, and that we need more space and support for local artists and space for small businesses and startups. We heard that transportation needs to be accessible, safe, and affordable, and that just having connections between places is not sufficient on its own. And public transit needs to be more frequent, reliable, and easier to get to. On protection and enhancement of natural resources, we heard a desire for an enhanced tree canopy throughout the county, having clean and protected waterways, rivers, and streams, and concentrating development to keep natural resources protected. We also heard support for local food systems and community gardens, for equitable access to and distribution of resources, amenities, and services, and regional cooperation on transportation networks and other opportunities. We also had an online questionnaire open, and we heard similar input there, which we've summarized here. We heard support for preservation and protection of natural, water supply, agricultural, historic resources, and also rural areas. Equitable and accessible opportunities for all community members. Infrastructure to support growth, safe and accessible options for all types of transportation. Affordable housing with a variety of housing options. Climate resiliency and climate action. Mixed-use development with access to public transit, sidewalks, and bike paths, and energy efficient housing and buildings. So after hearing community input at our roundtables and online, we have several main takeaways summarized here. So there is substantial support for the 4 big ideas. And there are significant areas of common ground at this high altitude, despite potential disagreement on how we implement the big ideas. And we will be able to come back to where we heard support for the big picture concepts as we refine the goals, objectives, and strategies in upcoming AC 44 phases. So now I will turn it over to Vlad to talk about the draft framework.
Thank you, Tori. And good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Thank you again, representing the consultant team for this, and working collaboratively with the staff, and really appreciate your devoting a full work session to this real milestone in the process. So as Tori mentioned, we took the community input that we heard on the big ideas and put them into this draft framework for an equitable and resilient community. In your packet, it's posted for the public. We also have some posters of it in case we want to actually play with the wording. But I'm not going to go through all of it, but I just wanted to share some of the big picture points within this framework, and especially how it relates to our next phase of work, the current comprehensive plan, and how it could be useful as we revise that plan and update it. The next slide. I think this is important. I'm just going to read these, but the purpose of this, Tori touched on this, but it's to find common ground because you have different interests, obviously, in the county, but finding that common ground to move forward with a policy direction for growth management. And to use this as a foundation of community support that we can come back to. Obviously, when we get to implementation and details, there's going to be some disagreements. We can use this framework to come back to and say, here's what we all agreed to. Let's keep these principles in finding a solution to move forward. Then obviously it's going to give specific guidance to the comprehensive plan to implement the board's initiatives for equity and climate action. And finally, the board also gave direction to the staff and the consultants to make a more user-friendly document, consolidated, and this will help us create that more streamlined document. Next slide. We touched on this, but really this framework is a bridge. It bridges phase 1 and phase 2 of the comprehensive plan document. Phase 1 is about growth management and incorporating the direction from the board that we've received. And phase 2 is about turning that input from the community into a policy direction for all the different chapters of the plan. So next slide. So here are some bullet points on the 4 big ideas, and I'm not going to read through these because they're what you have in your packet, but just a couple of takeaway points from each theme. So the green and resilient community theme relates closely to the countywide vision in the comprehensive plan. It talks about a greener future and preservation of natural values and resources for the rural area. And it also infuses more of the same kind of language and green networks into the development areas and new building practices. And that's right in line with county vision. Most importantly, though, this theme also hits on the board priority of developing a resilient future in the face of climate change. Next slide. Welcoming and equitable. This also relates directly to one of the board's initiatives on equity. And you'll note in this that the focus is on both current and future residents. So there's an emphasis on equitable distribution of services for current residents revitalizing older existing neighborhoods, as well as looking at future residents to build more equitable and complete communities for the future. Third one, next slide, is connected and accessible. And that relates to a lot of what we heard in the public comments. What we heard is there's a real desire to have better connections throughout the county, especially walking, biking, and transit. It relates to this theme that we heard also being able to age in place, having transportation options for all ages and abilities. And you'll also notice here that it relates to another theme of connectivity towards natural systems and things like wildlife streams or wildlife corridors or stream corridors in the rural areas as well. So it's think of connected and accessible in different dimensions. And then finally, next slide, thriving and prosperous. We heard a substantial positive feedback from the public on this theme. We heard that county is doing a lot of these things already, but some important comments we heard was that we need to have well-paying jobs for existing residents, not just jobs that recruit outside talent. But we also heard this very important kind of idea that there's an interconnectedness of this theme with the others. So for example, if you want to have living wage jobs, you need the supported policies of having transportation options, having affordable housing, so people can afford to live and work here. I think all these are interconnected, but this one especially connects with the others. So those are some high-level takeaways. We really look forward to your input in a couple of minutes on the wording here. But I wanted to touch on how this might relate to our next work effort, which is the refinement of the goals and objectives and strategies in the current comp plan. As you know, the current comp plan has 10 chapters. Each chapter has one goal, and each goal has multiple objectives, and then each objective has multiple strategies. So it's this kind of tree structure. This is the current set of goals, and you know these well, I'm sure, but you can see they're all these aspirational kind of end states. The county will do this, the county will be like this. So how do we start to refine this policy structure using this framework? Next slide. So I mentioned that this is a bridge between phase 1 and phase 2. These are the framework themes. We can use the public support that we have for these themes as a basis for refinement of these goals and the comprehensive plan chapters. And I want to reemphasize the value, I hope, of this framework for the next phase of work. Not only do we build on this platform of common ground for community input, but it also infuses the policy direction of equity and climate action. So it's trying to do all this in a fairly compact 4 big themes. And what we need to do next, obviously, is to start crosswalking this with the comprehensive plan. So we've started to crosswalk some of the key concepts within each of these themes with the chapters. We included this crosswalk in your packet, but it's really a first step on how we might embark on this process of refining the comprehensive plan. It's really a phase 2 effort, so we just kind of started the ball rolling on this. But for example, the goals, objectives, and strategies for the growth management chapter, you can see it's 1 goal, 1 objective, and 3 strategies. And they basically reinforce the county vision concept of having development areas, rural areas. And I think that the framework can add a lot of depth. It can reinforce that vision, but it can add a lot of depth in these other areas that we've heard to make that a more robust growth management policy that can then inform a lot of the other chapters in the plan. And then we did this for each theme. Next slide. And again, won't read all of them, but just to kind of share how this might proceed. For example, in the green and resilient theme, obviously this theme will provide direct guidance on natural resources and cultural and historic resources chapter. And then perhaps a little less directly, but still importantly, to chapters like transportation or parks and rec. And finally, I think you find this with all the themes, they will give good input into refinement of policies for the development areas and rural areas. The next one, welcoming and equitable. This is something that we found is when you go through the plan goals, it's not readily evident in many of the existing comprehensive plans. It's a new kind of initiative from the board. So we would anticipate this theme to refine most of the comp plan chapters, but especially ones like growth management, housing, community facilities. And then connected and accessible. The direct connection here obviously is transportation, also community facilities, but also parks and rec and natural resources, as you note the many dimensions of connectedness. And finally, thriving and prosperous, direct connection to economic development, but also see connections to chapters like natural and cultural resources. And then these supporting policies that people mentioned for transportation and housing. And this is obviously not definitive. You all can draw many other connections, I'm sure, but it's just meant to give you a sense of how we might approach the next phase, building on this community input to start refining those chapters. And I look forward to your input, but Tori just was going to touch on next steps, I guess.
Thank you, Vlad. So again, just a quick reminder that we will share the Planning Commission feedback with the board and this same draft framework and ask the board for their input. And then based on the Planning Commission and board feedback, we will finalize the framework to wrap up phase one. And then as we move into phase two, we will review and analyze existing conditions, trends, and challenges and opportunities for each main topic, such as transportation, housing, and then develop policies for each topic using the final framework to guide this work and updating the framework along the way if necessary, and use the framework to guide the structure of the plan. And in phases 2 and 3, we will continue to explore the growth management options that we shared in the previous phase 1 round of engagement. And we are also in the process of developing an equity and climate action lens, which will be used to evaluate AC 44 recommendations, and the lens will be shared and used during the upcoming phases. And I'll turn it back over to Vlad to share the questions for discussion.
And the questions are very simple. From our perspective, it would really help to know if you see this framework providing a good platform, as we discussed, for revising the goals, objectives, strategies. If not, what's missing? And do you recommend forwarding it to the board for consideration, obviously with your input and guidance on it? Is there anything else to add?
I think that's it.
Thank you all. So just kind of looking at the clock now, we have a little over an hour. And I'll make a recommendation, love your feedback to my colleagues here. Perhaps we could start with maybe just some overarching questions on what you've heard. And then perhaps it might make sense as we look through here, there are 4 components to the framework. So maybe we could spend a little time on each, kind of critiquing, debating, pulling, tugging, pushing on each one of those sections. Perhaps it's 10 minutes each, and that will leave us about 20 minutes roughly for that first question there. For anything else that maybe falls through the cracks, I think the last question there is yes or no. We probably need 30 seconds for that, right? But the rest of them there, that sounds like a reasonable approach. We could go that way. Sound good? Okay. All right. So maybe we start with any overarching questions that you might have based off of what you heard that might not be specific to any of those 4 categories. And maybe we'll start with Lonnie. If you don't have anything, you say no, and just kind of work around the room. So Commissioner Murray.
I think most of my comments are going to be very specific to the sections. I will say we've received the email from Karen Firehawk and some of her great suggestions in terms of including more local references in all of this, I think, but also really looking in terms of well, I'll hold some. We'll get into some of these in the green resilience section. So,
Okay. All right. Commissioner Curzon.
Oh, so I think likewise, I thought Karen's comments on using references. And since we're keeping this fairly high level in general, I'll do the same. And you can dive into the specifics. So what I think would be helpful, and I look at this crosswalk, and even though there's definitely some new language in here and a focus in a couple of areas that maybe were not there in the comp plan, they may have been there in other documents throughout the years. In fact, there's a lot of similarities. But what I don't see, and I was looking at some of those older documents that I wasn't familiar with before my time on the planning commission and so forth. I don't see where we've looked at strategies to measure success or to measure how we're doing it with some of these goals. So some of them I said are very similar. You know, how long have we been talking about housing and affordable housing, right? How long have we been talking about transportation and providing those transportations in areas of density and creating those areas of density and so forth. So how do we measure, looking back, right, 8 years ago, what are we doing well? And maybe we need to just do more of it, right? If we're doing it well, but we need to improve. And what are we not doing well? And perhaps what we need is a different strategy than what we have been doing to accomplish some of these areas, because we all know what the definition of insanity is. So to me, that's really what I'm not seeing yet. And again, this is very high level, but it is a high level concept. Let's identify the goals and let's identify ways to measure if we've been doing these similar things well or not, or if they're new concepts, how are we going to measure them? Some of them are a little bit more tricky than, I mean, I think we can measure. Actually, you gave a measurement. You said we only developed 58% of the density. Well, I think that's an important measure because it gives us a benchmark of how we've been developing to the density that we said we were or could, and what impact is that going to have on our total capacity. So that's an important measure. There's a lot of these areas that we can do similar type measures that will help us identify our strategies in the future, because maybe we shouldn't just keep trying to do the same thing over and over again.
Plus one that your comments.
Yeah, that was really helpful comments. Couple questions, just like super, and if these are too far in the weeds, just cut me off, but a couple of really simple, basic questions on the slides. You shared a slide that showed scenarios, residential scenarios, and you were talking about unit types. Did you dive into the specific unit type, like single family condominiums?
We did not get into that level of detail.
Okay, so just high level.
We could provide that, though. I think we do have some of that. We do an annual certificate of occupancy report, and that does break down by unit type. And I think we've pulled that together from the last 10 years. So
I think it'd be really interesting to see trends in that area and then see how that sort of moves, in the direction of looking forward. What are the trends, not only for us, but for some of our other benchmark communities and what that looks like. Second question is related to the public input that you received through the process. Were there specific service providers that were included in the process of the public input? Like, for example, Rivanna Water and Sewer Authority or VDOT or some others? Were they were all part of the process?
So a couple of things. We did an internal staff focus group to share the big ideas and get staff input on those. And then also we've had separate conversations as well with the service providers, more, just giving updates on where we're at, the results from the land use build out, keeping them up to date.
Got it. Okay. So, and then the last thing I'll mention, which is a little bit of a continuation of what Luis was just saying, and that is relative to goals and measurable, being able to measure what these are. And I'll have more specific questions, I guess, or comments when we get into the details, but I think tied to that service provider connection, not overpromise, not overshooting, or, going to a point where we have these new goals that we want to look at, or we're trying to achieve. And I love the way this sort of language was, this is where we are at 2044, right? But can we actually get there? And is there a way that we can get there that is actually doable? I think it's something to focus on. And then I wrote down the word accountability too. So as we go through sort of incrementally, and continue to consider this, that we have ways to use the word measure, I think, to be accountable and adjust if need be, so light on our feet, I guess. That's all. Thanks.
Sure. So thank you. So I have to say that the crosswalks were helpful in sort of unpacking a bunch of what might be sort of where we've been and where we're going and how those might link up together. So obviously it's not a complete package there, but it's a way to sort of visually understand and appreciate what this process is going to have to wrestle with as we move forward. And therein lies my problem with this whole process. Not this process, but the process of comp plans. Is that it's truly ambiguous, so I appreciate that. And we live in a community that is multifaceted. And this plan attempts to please all those individuals. And I frankly am frustrated by that. I've shared that outside of this meeting with a few people. That in fact, the ability or the desire to please all those people is why I think we see some of the things that we see. And again, this is not against you, but this is against the plan. We see a large degree of hyperbole here that I actually don't believe the county can control. And so, or let me put it this way, I don't think our county is willing to use the tools to impact, of which we can go further down. I think the sort of the intimate, will I say, conflict of us holding on to this rural community versus this hopefully dynamic development area is how we move through that successfully and in an important way, which I think the sort of the overlying pieces of this will in fact be a huge sort of magic trick in my opinion, in my mind. Simply because when I've heard discussions around similarly type things in our community, we always come to a negotiated out, which no one wins. I'll just say one, so I'm not even thinking about this, sort of how we got to or didn't get to a redistricting of the school systems, that it became such a tense and it didn't often, it emerged almost on some unfortunate stereotypes about people that it never happened. And so you've got some things that in other jurisdictions, it just would have happened. And, we would have done things, but we are so sensitive to how we sit in what I think is really kind of a community of competing interests that I don't know how this is going to work. And so while I think the process will be good, I don't know that the reality of what the process turns out, that the supervisors will be willing to put the things in place to make it happen.
Thank you, Commissioner Bivens. Insightful comments. I have an overarching question. There's a couple of observations that we can kind of move into the rest of the program. Going back to the community engagement piece, just curious, you may have already answered this in the past work session. I forgot to write it down, but like any kind of metrics on like roughly how many people participated, the demographics, that could be by career stage or gender or race or socioeconomic. Just did we really get if you could talk a little bit about, did we get a swath of the community and not the same folks that come over and over and over again?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. As far as total numbers, I think there were about 115 people total who showed up to the roundtables, and then I think 24 people filled out the online questionnaire. And we did have some optional demographic questions, which, at any given roundtable, maybe a third or half of people filled out. So I think it's, especially at the in-person roundtables, I think a little bit more diversity than we've seen at our past roundtables, including by income and race and things like that, based on who chose to answer those questions. But don't have, full statistical results from that.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. The numbers feel light to me, right? And I think we have didn't we like buy a van in the community where we can go out to different places?
And that was just the last round of engagement.
Yes.
So there were significantly more survey responses in earlier rounds.
What do you mean by, sorry to interrupt, what do you mean
Yeah.
by significantly more?
I think the growth management options questionnaire, which, you know, we drew the
Yeah.
common themes from was 474.
Got it, okay, thanks.
You all feel like that in your professional expertise, that is a sufficient sampling, maybe is a word, of community engagement? You feel like that is a true picture of members of the community?
I have to say, in just about everywhere we work, we don't get a truly representative, either numbers or, proportion of the demographics of the community. It's getting worse. People are, free to engage with comments on social media, but coming to these meetings or filling out these surveys is really declining these days.
So maybe I would just encourage us as a group to think of innovative ways to do that, whether it's a pulse survey, like, can you just answer this question real quick and it pops up on Facebook and collect data that way? It's just some thoughts. From an observation standpoint, I said two things. One is big, one's kind of small. I'll do the small one first. I would just be sensitive to the images as you move forward in presentations, to the images that you use, right? We emphasize, I kind of circled the word, what was it? Welcoming and equitable. Yeah, so the blue piece of the pie chart, right? And like in a lot of the images that showed gatherings of community, I didn't see anyone that looked like me, right? So just kind of being sensitive to like the images that we portray as you take this to the board. Easy fix, right? No, it's no malicious intent. It's just being sensitive to that. On the bigger side, I think it's, I circled equitable and resilient communities, right? So that's kind of the tagline we've been using. And I think as we think about policy, it's easy to kind of put those in two separate buckets. But as a true framework, I think you'll find something special when you study it as an intersection, right? And so that's something that I would highly recommend, is what happens at the intersection of equitable and resilient, right? Like, what I wouldn't want is for us to be stepping over humans to save a tree, right? And so what happens when those two things intersect? How does that impact the framework? So those are my two comments there. Does anyone else have anything to add before we dive into the deeper sections?
Sure, I would just suggest for our own knowledge that it might be wise to look at, it might be helpful to look at the Board of Supervisors draft FY 24-28 strategic plan goals and objectives.
Okay.
Because what's interesting with that is how well, I know this is not done with that intention, but how well there's some overlap between some of the issues here and here. And so hopefully, having heard my comment about what I think how the supervisors will engage with some of this, hopefully that's an indicator that there's at least a migration towards several central parks here, because I think what you've mentioned about how do you blend together both resilience in a community, resilience about a climate, that they're also struggling to.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for sharing that. So, yes, sir. Welcome, Mr. Missile and Mr. Murray.
Sorry, just one other quick question. You mentioned on one of the slides that there is agreement along certain lines, but then there was, and I wrote this, disagreement on how to implement the ideas. Can you unpack that a little more about how you were seeking ideas from and what this disagreement was?
Sure. And, at this phase, we, intend to be very high level, but sometimes, during the actual roundtables and community input, community members wanted to start talking about implementation and getting a little bit into more detail. And that is more in depth than we're getting to in this phase, but it's good to know that, in phases 2 and 3, when we actually develop policies and action steps, that there will then, be disagreement between community members on what's the best way to actually implement these big ideas.
Got it. So that was a little more forward thinking.
One that I heard one was funding. How are we gonna, if we're talking about transit connecting, is that county funding, state funding? So, you
Right.
can get disagreement when you talk about things like funding, but at least you get the goal of common purpose.
Yeah.
I will also add in I sat in on this first bit, but there's a lot of conversation about the county should do this. The county has the ability to do that. And some of that is actually not true. And I'll give, for instance, there's an individual who just believes that the county should mandate that everyone's house should have 34R. Insulation. And while that's a really wonderful thing, there was a disconnect that if the county were to mandate that, that would also push the price points on houses to here.
Right.
Which, while it might give you a more efficient home, you would probably eliminate a whole bunch of people who would be able to afford those homes. And the county, I think the staff did a really wonderful job saying, well, the county can sort of encourage developers to do that, but they can't go in and say, you now must have R30, I think it's R30, whatever it's called, some high density thing. And that from that point forward, that's what we need. So there's this interesting, what I will say, expectation of the power of county.
Yeah.
Which is not actually true. And so how do you deal with that? I think you'd find that I'm not making it up.
Just one comment that we also come back to as we go specifically through the sections is the commingling of a lot of these different concepts. The crosswalk is helpful to sort of identify what you're talking about. But once we move later and this is published and there is no crosswalk, some of these things become very vague. And it's not clear what they're applying to. How we currently treat the rural area and the growth area, for example, are very different. And there's a lot of phrases in here where it's not clear whether you're talking about both or one or the other. And so I would encourage you to be very specific. When it does refer to both, to put both. When you're talking about one, put one.
Thank you, Commissioner Murray. All right, so for the time remaining, and you let me know if you need something different, right? If we break out and talk about each one of these 4 areas based off of that question number 1 that you have up there, it leaves about 11 minutes per area. And so maybe we can start with the green and resilient to the first one, a green and resilient community. And we can start tackling question 1 in that perspective. And so with that, open the floor. If anyone has any specific comments that they want to take.
So one small thing, I would say, where it has protected natural resources that include water, wildlife, forests, and other natural resources, I would encourage you to include the word biodiversity. We do have a biodiversity action plan in the county, so that is important thing to include. There's so once again, here's one of those examples where I would say it's nice that you have a dotted line. But it says new neighborhoods which are compact mixed-use developments. And you have an arrow pointing development areas, which is really helpful. Once that goes away, are we talking about rural areas? Because currently our rural areas are not mixed use. So, and then it says existing neighborhoods have had parks, trails, and new landscaping and tree canopy. We don't get the rural area. Well, there are rural parks. We don't get trails. We don't get sidewalks. We don't get bike lanes. Those are not things because those all come through offers. And since there are currently no rezonings in the rural area, there are no offers. So I think in the rural area, it's much more about preserving the things that we have, as opposed to constructing things. Oh, and then also I just bring back again to, I think in terms of, Karen's comments, she had talked about the importance of green infrastructure and the importance of things like green streets. I think it may be a little bit specific for this, but I think definitely one of the things I would encourage is I think we need to look at a concept of ecological density. encouraging ecological density, particularly in our growth areas, to do more with less in terms of ecological services. And a great example of that is the Dell project, for example, which species by species actually has greater biological diversity than a lot of wetlands in Elmore County. Treats more gallons of stormwater in a smaller space. So this idea that we, when we have less space, we need to do more with it. So our green areas need to perform better to do more with that little space. Then we don't have 100 acres. We only have maybe 1 acre. So,
Well, honey, could you just, for those who may be listening, say what the Dell is?
oh yes, true. So the Dell is this great project at UVA, one of UVA's several stream daylighting projects. And prior to this daylighting, it was really kind of a wasted field of grass. Once they took the stream, they brought it to the surface, they planted it with 100% native plants. They put in a nice pond. There's an attractive feature for the community. The community likes to go to the pond and walk around it. They're providing pollinator habitat they're providing, but it's also constructed not just as an attractive feature, but there's baffles built into it so that it actually treats stormwater as water is flowing through it. So as opposed to the out of sight, out of mind method where we take streams and put them underground, this is really, by having this on the surface, we can see the stormwater treatment taking place. And the community gets to appreciate this beautiful space before there's nothing. So a great example of what I would call ecological density.
Thank you for sharing that, Commissioner. It was done 20 years ago.
And they've integrated some similar projects too in the UVA South Lawn project as well.
Oh. I wasn't familiar with that. Anyone else?
Yeah, so, yeah, in a similar vein, I think when I looked at this, and I understand the purpose here, but again, Lonnie, as we think about moving this forward, some of these crosswalks probably go away, and this is where the examples that Commissioner Firehawk was talking about would be very important, where you can tie, some of these mixed-use communities, where is that happening now? What's a good example of where that's taking place, and build that in. I want to pick up on where Commissioner Bivens left off, because that is something that struck me, particularly as I look at these 4 sections, green, resilient, economic development. And some of them at their face do seem to be in conflict, right? And I think that's what Commissioner Bivens is bringing up. I don't believe there's anything here that is trying to reconcile that conflict. It's just stating them. We're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. I think you should tackle the conflict head on and say, these are potentially in conflict. Now, where maybe we disagree a little bit is I'm not sure that just because there's a conflict, they can't actually both occur. But it may bring us to the table to think about and look at examples. The Dell, maybe somebody would say, oh, we can't do anything with that piece of property. We're never going to get that kind of efficiency out of it and amenity. Well, someone proved that you can. So perhaps that's how we can move some of this conversation forward, is by identifying in this document, here's where you have a potential conflict. Now, maybe you can offer up some suggestions or some examples of where communities have tackled their natural resources, economic developments, and densifying in a meaningful way, and in a way that meets the goals of each one of these sections. So I don't think we should run away from those conflicts or not try to address them. I think you should actually highlight them. And that to me is my main comment with some of these, that there are a number of things in here that I feel, at least at their face value, they're in conflict with each other. I don't believe that necessarily they have to be.
Stay. Yes.
So yeah, we're just going in order.
Yeah, sure.
That's easier.
There's only 5 of us, right?
Everybody
Yeah.
It's easier.
Yeah, exactly. So I love the way each one of us has a little bit of a different.
Yeah.
And mine's a little bit different, but also the same. Yes. So jumping ahead to sort of the end, I think we're talking a lot about, in general, we're talking about the what and the how.
Mm,
Right? What are we doing? This is what it's gonna look like in 2044, and then we're talking about,
mhm.
to your point, you're supporting drafting policies and action steps to create the how. That's how we get there. And I think tied to a lot of the comments that have already been made, you know, success for me is that policy and resource are in balance. And I think as we go through each of these different headings, I think thinking about how the policies that come out of these are going to be paired with resources. And you know, looking at, and I'll get this just a little bit more in a second, but looking at the big general question here, does the framework for an equitable and resilient community provide guidance? I think in general, yes. I mean, it's hard to argue with these 4 categories. They're pretty broad and pretty all encompassing. The one thing that strikes me is that as you focus on the starting point, which were the 2 what was it? Equity and climate action. A lot of these sort of start to just then be their own equity and climate action, sort of like restating that same thing. And one thing, Vlad, that you mentioned that really stood out to me was the welcoming and equitable community, which we'll get to in a minute, was unique in a sense. And so thinking about how that's unique, I think will be important. In terms of green and resilient community, I agree with examples of what has been seen. It strikes me that this one also crosses the line a little bit to economic development. And thinking about how it's mentioned here, sustainable farming and heritage-based, and ecologically based tourism. How those are linked then to one of the 4 other groups, which was this one, thriving and prosperous community. And so it's not that you think about a thriving and prosperous community only in the sense of economic development in the development areas, but you think about it holistically throughout the whole county, I think is an important thing. And then, you know, getting back to that question about the goals, right? As we go through drafting policies and action steps, knowing what the goals are clearly, I think is going to be important. What other communities, what are the other specific goals that communities have attempted to achieve? And I think about UVA, sorry, I keep saying about how UVA is such a great example.
The other side.
It's an example. So you take it off.
But I just think about the action plan, that's not the name of it, but you know, they have very clear goals for carbon neutrality. And I think thinking about that and how that gets put into this policy so that we can then get back to that accountability and measurability through the process.
All right. Just take a pause for just a second. Let's make sure the clerk has recognized that our official chair arrived at 4:51, and I will be handing over the reins. So we were just going around the horn, talking about each one of those 4 pieces of pie based off of that first question there.
Sure.
And we're just working around the room. So.
Where are we in the working?
We're actually being very good about going into. We're doing this. We're being very good about that. So.
Are you gonna blow that up?
No. I'm actually next, so. I'm fine with that. So I'm sort of gonna sort of step into a couple places here. One that's on the plan update and then the big idea piece of it. So on the plan update, I'm gonna push back on the sentence as part of the commitment. So in 40 and 44, as part of the commitment to resilience, the county has encouraged sustainable regenerative architectural, not architecture, that would be interesting, agricultural practices. And these have in turn been supported through a robust local food system. And so, you know, as exciting and as good as that language is, it is not going to happen. And I say, you know, I use strong words, that's just how I operate. So I went and looked at the census, the 2017 census, but agriculture that's put out by the US Department of Agriculture. And Albemarle County is 1% of the Commonwealth's agricultural business. 1%. And counties around us are like 3%. The one in the valley was like 8%, I believe. And so the fact, and so this to come back here, and the fact that what we produce, while it's good, but we do not produce vegetables. We do not produce food elements here. We produce, I can give each of you one of these if you care. Which I just think is fine. I just want to say, I think we should be honest about who we are as an ag business. And that we're not going to be a breadbasket. Yes, Lloyd.
I was just gonna mention that that doesn't include farms that are 5 acres.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of farms in Monroe County, like the farm at Red Hill, that are not included in there, that do indeed produce local things. So
I agree. And so here's where my point is. You can be a boutique farm market, you're not going to feed the county. We have lots of boutique places in this county, but we do not have farms at the scale that can actually do what this says it's going to do, feed the county. And so that's my piece. I am not against, and I'm just saying, I'm looking at scale and realities. Okay, in order for us to be the kind of place that feeds this county, you're not going to do it with the kind of structures we have right now. And a 5-acre farm is not going to feed this county. A 5-acre farm is not even going to be able to supply the food banks with the various elements they need to be able to feed the food, to feed people who don't have those kind of resources. So while all I'm suggesting is that the narrative about our ag business here needs to not
Sound over optimistic or over
Well, it's just
representing
not,
what's possible.
it's not the
right?
business that we're in.
Right,
It's not the
Yeah.
business we're in. That's all I'm saying. We are not that kind of, we're not the breadbasket of Central Virginia. There are other places which are, but we're not. And so you can look at that if you want to. The one thing I'd like to also to have us look at here is this whole idea about how would we deal with climate migration, which we're going to get a full face. Some of us are going to get a full face of that in a couple of days, depending on where your friends and relatives are, depending on where. And so at some point, and there was, I forget who put this out, maybe might have been the Chesapeake Bay Association Committee, but it's this whole thing about what happens when Virginia Beach and Norfolk and all those places start losing sizable chunks of land. Where those people gonna go? If they want to stay in the Commonwealth, they're coming here, or some portions of them come here. And how are we going to deal with that? What kinds of things do we have in place to be able to deal with that kind of climate-induced migration? What are we looking about? What are we looking at in this whole green and resilient community? What are we looking about energy diversification? You know, we're going to have come before us at some point, perhaps not this year, but in the future, sort of large-scale solar installations. That if we really are concerned about what that's not the end-all be-all, but if we really are concerned about how do we stop being dependent on one type of energy source, we're gonna have to figure that out. We're gonna have to wrestle about what that means. Is this a location that's gonna be welcoming to us? And I don't know where we are. The other thing that I'm sort of thinking, this goes to the development piece, because if we really are thinking about trying to preserve green spaces, particularly in areas that are being developed, then we have to somehow or another sort of pitch away from the garden apartment developments that come to us. We've got to figure out a way to encourage developers to leave that model, because it takes a lot of land, because 3 stories, this kind of density on it, and yet if we could do with a bit more height, then we could preserve some land, and perhaps that's whatever those encouragements are around that we could do that, which also would lead into, I guess, another filigree, how do we use our land? What's our parking look like? What do our parking regulations look like? Because we're, even as much as our chair talks about putting different kinds of surfaces in, most people don't. They go for the standard pieces of surface, and that it's a heat, it's a heat sink. So those kinds of things about it's. And again, I understand that I'm speaking about things which are in often the developed part of our community, but if we're trying to sort of blend those ideas across our jurisdiction, then some of that work needs to take place in the things that we build and how we encourage people to build and what do we do with that. And then there's my piece about, can we just be honest about what kind of ag business goes on here? And it's not about being a breadbasket, even though there's boutique farms here that do that. But it's not about being a breadbasket. It's about providing other kinds of agricultural business, and agricultural resources to the nation in some cases and to our community. So that's on that part.
Okay, well, that's a tough act to follow.
It is not, it is not.
Well, I've said a lot about this topic in multiple meetings. I guess, I'll just make a couple of quick comments. I would, and this might only be me who feels like this, but the way that it read, I know it's to be aspirational. And it reads, so it's written as if we've already achieved this, and this is the place we live in. And the more I read of this entire document, the more I'm like, this is a wonderful fantasy place that I would love to visit one day. But I just, it was almost like too much. You know, so that's more of an overarching comment. I'd rather talk about what we're striving for than to write it as if it, because I really don't believe that everything that in the way that it's written could actually be achieved. And not to be negative, Nelly, but I don't want to write something that sounds so, I don't want to use the word far-fetched, but I will, that it, you know, it's like sort of the perfect world scenario. And I'd rather us sound a little more humble. You know, like we aspire to utilize local food. And we, you know, I go to the farmer's market religiously before I ever go to the grocery store. I get everything I possibly can from the farmer's market, but to your point, I then have to go to the Food Lion. Because I just can't feed my family off the farmer's market. I can't find everything. So I agree, I do agree with what you said. And I'd like somehow, and this, I don't have perfect words for staff right now, but somehow to make this sound a little bit more like the unique and special place that we are. So, you know, like we have amazing mountains and scenic views and rolling hills. And I guess just bringing in some of that feeling that I wouldn't be able to just take this paragraph and just stick it in California. You know, like that there's something about the way that it's written that tells me I'm at the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains and this is my place. And I you know, because from a consultant standpoint, I could make hay with this by just putting in every single consultant plan that I write. But I just wanted to find a way to talk a little bit more about this place and why this place is special. The other, and this is more of an overarching comment too, and then I'm going to pass the baton, I guess. But it just strikes me that I tell you what, I'm going to hold that thought till the end because it's more of an overarching thought. I'm going to center myself, gather myself. There we go. All right. So does that take us through the first one?
Yeah, I think like your vice chair.
He hasn't gone. Okay.
No, I always go last, no worries.
Go ahead.
I'll be very quick, 2 comments. One is the word green. Not that I want to debate that. It just seems like it's so vague and watered down that I don't want it to undermine the importance of what you're trying to do. And then the last part is to kind of piggyback off of what Commissioner Bivens was starting to share about the migration due to the climate. When I think of resiliency as an architect, I'm thinking like the built environment structures. And so like another piece of that is mitigation and adaptation, right? So not being reactive to climate change, but how do we become proactive, right? As these storms get bigger and bigger and flooding is more and more real for this area. So the mitigation and adaptation piece to it. So that's it for me, and you can move on to the next one, Madam Chair.
Can I go out of order?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Yes, we are having a work
There's something
session.
that you mentioned really resonated with me, and I've looked through this again. I don't see the word preserve anywhere. Preservation. And I think Commissioner Firehawk, your point is really resonated with me that we have so much. What is it that we would like to continue, enhance, preserve? And you know, that goes along, I think, with the realization or the acknowledgement of the place, right? It makes it more personal as opposed to something that could be more boilerplate.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah, just add something on that. I mean, it ties into what I said before about in the rural area, the main thing is about preservation. And then the urban area, it's about restoration. So it's about, you know, in the rural area, it's about do no harm. But let's preserve what we have And the growth area, it's about redevelopment, about
Regreening potential.
regreen.
Densification.
Yeah,
You can densify and regreen at the same time. In
Yeah.
fact, that they go hand in hand, as you just said.
yeah, absolutely. And I think the understanding of how those two hands play together, I think
Right.
is very important.
Absolutely, and I'll just touch very briefly on what my bigger picture thing was gonna be about this, because it kind of ties into what you guys just said. The county is creating a city around a city with our urban ring, right? And we're struggling because it was a suburban development pattern, and then we're trying to like make it into an urban one. And yet, looking at our attorney, we lack the powers that our neighbor has right here. Because we are not a city. But on the other hand, what struck me also is that and this actually came up in the small group session I went to last Thursday with some of the comments from the citizens. Was that, you know, I know we say the rural area, and that's a whole other discussion. But we'll just for now say urban and rural. I feel like there's gonna be different visions depending on where you sit. And so some of these things in this document are about really things that you would think of for the urban ring. But I would be concerned with very different other things for the rural area. And so I guess while it's more convenient to smush it all together. And I'm not suggesting we have one urban vision, one rural, but somehow we have to acknowledge that these are really different landscapes. And we have different aspirations depending on where we're planning for. And that needs to be brought up too. So. Good luck now. Just kidding. We will help with that, of course, but I just think that needs to come through, because it would be easier if this were just for the city of Charlottesville, or just for Stanton or Richmond even. But this is such a disparate place in our landscapes, and depending on where we sit, what we're trying to protect or preserve or regreen or retrofit or mitigate or whatever. So you
Yeah.
have to have, that has to come through.
Yeah, I think just one thing about that rural, urban. And to me, there's always a third sort of
Yeah.
less known and forgotten area, which are the boundaries.
Right, the intermix,
Yeah,
something,
right.
we call that the wildland urban interface.
Yeah, exactly, which I think is just important. It's not only between the growth ring and.
It's not the no man's land.
But it's also our boundaries, bigger.
So it's really a
Talk about
continuum.
that.
I mean, you know, the way I think about it is if you live on a large property in the rural, you can grow your own food. So you have access to local food. You have plenty of areas to walk because you have 100 acres of your own personal trails you can walk on. You have all these services that are what are called natural services that are there in the land. As that land gets smaller and smaller, there's natural ecosystem service. And you also have a certain amount of stormwater treatment. You can treat a lot of stormwater on 100 acres. You can provide a lot of biodiversity. You can provide a lot of climate mitigation. As that land gets smaller and smaller, you have to do more and more with less. And you shift from preserving to restoration. So it's really it's continuum between these two things. As that parcel gets smaller and smaller, the continuum changes.
Yeah, and I think that's where partnerships increase, the need for partnerships and I don't want to use the word policy, but guidelines that are more cross boundaries across those 100 acres that are now the 10 acres, you know, and that's where, yeah, that's
18.5 acres.
yeah.
Good discussion. So are we ready for the next one? No, we're on time here.
Run a little short now, but we're good.
Okay. All right. So are we
Equitable community.
equitable? I know, I'm like I
Oh,
drank
no.
coffee all the way here in my car, so I'm like scrolling like.
You just read
Dude, I'm
it.
already-
We're going to the next one.
What's good?
All right, so we're gonna round robin again.
Yep.
You want to go in a different go back that way, or
Yeah,
Start
yeah.
again?
Lonnie's got-
Yeah, go ahead, Lonnie.
Lonnie's starting the thing.
Lonnie's all warmed up?
Yeah.
So the first thing I would call out here is, once again, it says vibrant mixed use communities as a compact urban neighborhoods and their centers with a gradation of density as their edges. This clearly seems to me to be a development area concept. And there is a little arrow here that points to development area. But what happens when this crosswalk disappears and this stands alone? Likewise, neighborhoods that are inclusive and contain a mix of uses, green spaces, and variety of housing types, accessible and affordable to all income levels and abilities. And that one actually has an arrow that points to rural area. Now, this is problematic. Currently in the rural area, we only have one housing type, which is single family. And so this would be a major upzoning of the rural area that would, it's sort of encapsulated in this section right here. And at its extreme, there are some other problematic things here, which are that an apartment building in the rural area, well, we don't have public septic in the rural area. So you'd have to authorize private septic for an apartment building. So to imply that we could have apartment buildings in the rural areas, that's problematic and a major change in vision for the county. And I think while there may be some room for maybe duplexes or something like that in the rural area, I think we need to separate housing type and number of houses from each other. Because I could get behind saying, all right, for every development right, you can build one housing unit. And so you could take 2 of your development rights and build the duplex. I'm good with that. That's great. That actually would preserve more land in the rural area. It's a great concept. But if you're saying you had one development right, and now you're going to be able to put a duplex there, well, now you've doubled the density of the rural area. And that's problematic.
Makes sense. Please.
I mean, I don't really know that I have anything specific. I agree with the comments on this section that it boils down to when this crosswalk goes away and back to providing examples. And I think along with those examples, just harken back, identify how we can begin to measure what we've, areas that we're doing well in. I mean, that to me, the one thing that, again, the language, right? We are living in this idyllic place, and new developments have been designed and complete communities, with core amenities, and which is all great. But I do think that it could be anywhere, and so putting it in one place, as Commissioner Firehawk was saying, putting it in its place here, we have a great opportunity because of who we are in this community, where we are, the people that are coming here. We are a pretty diverse community that's getting more and more diverse every day. So I think there's a great opportunity to leverage that. So that's the welcoming piece and the type of housing that we may be looking at. We have a lot of different types of housing from the single family rural that we forget that's really where most of our affordable housing is in the county, and it's going away. So I am concerned about the crosswalk. I get it. I think it's a really helpful tool in these early phases to kind of harken back. Here's where we were. Here's how it connects to the comp plan. I think all that is very useful, but I do think that we need a couple of other tools here, and I would say the identifying. I'm going to repeat myself one last time, but identifying those potential conflicts, the inherent conflicts potentially that are here. Let's identify them, and then let's also talk about methodologies on how we measure where we've done things well and where we're failing. And let's own up to it. I mean, there are some things that we're not doing very well at all, and housing is one of them, and transit is another. And so, we should call them out, and maybe this is where the idyllic image to me starts to erode, because okay, that's great. I know we may want to get there. We may want to be the breadbasket of Central Virginia. it's a far cry. It's the same thing, like some of these, I think, are just as saying, well, we're a long way of saying we're gonna have this kind of affordable housing in these communities. I mean, how do we begin to get there? And I think understanding where we've been and what's working for us and what's not working for us, it's gotta be the first place. I mean, we have to take ownership of that and understand how we've been doing things and what's been working and not. So I won't keep repeating that with every section, because to me, a lot of it is about those two
Yeah,
elements. So I won't say.
Just a few things. I know we're running out of time, so I'll go quickly. Under the heading of housing types and accessibility and affordability. Preaching to the choir here, but thinking about policies matched with incentives. Right? So how, as a developer, are you able to achieve that? The other thing is that funding is something that isn't always discussed, like how do we bring funding through to help with the equitability of the community? And then resources and partnerships. Two other things. One is under definition, the definition of complete communities. So if I'm a developer and I'm interested in developing in Charlottesville, Albemarle County. And I'm told you need to bring a complete community to us in order for us to accept that. As those that sort of oversee the land use process and planning, and development and zoning and so on, what is that filter that we should look at those communities and those applications through? It's a pretty practical question, right? Like, and what is the direction that we give the development community to be able to match this goal of complete communities? How does that look? Because I think that's important, and then matching that with reality, right?
So I'm gonna sort of break up my comments in a couple of pieces here. One is probably gonna be sort of my usual rough and tumble sort of annoyance, if that's something that we do have in our present comp plan. The other one's just sort of gonna be some other things. So part of what we do here when we develop things, we sort of say that the sewage and the water have to come to this new development. We always say if there's a new development. We never engage in the conversation that transportation has to be there too, a priori. We're always chasing the fact that Albemarle County does not own the transportation system. It's in a negotiated relationship with the city. That may change if some things happen, but it would be really cool if we could say, let's talk about how will it take, and I'm looking at the person who's going to be developing something really big in a few years. What would it take to have transportation included in your plan? That you go talk to CAT or go talk to the thing that's going to come down 29. I just can't remember the name of it right now. And that's not I just can't remember the name of it because it's about north of the Ravenna, trying to have transportation with more frequency.
rapid bus transit? Or
But it hasn't, we've gone for grants and we've received some grants.
Okay.
I know what you're talking
Yeah,
about.
to be able to bring on a scheduled time
Oh,
to
okay.
join up with the CAT bus. But that we think about that transportation, because we always talk about transportation, that's part of the development.
Yeah.
That we're talking, how are we gonna move people? Not how we're gonna move people inside, but how we're gonna move people away from that to someplace else. That would be really cool. The same thing that they did with the Crozet and Valley Connect, which is one of the images there that you just couldn't see, but it's one of the images there. What they're doing with the Virginia Breeze, that they're intentionally taking transportation through places to get them places. I think we need to be thinking about that. I also, and this is going to come to some of the things that Lonnie and Lou said, we need to figure out how to encourage people to build starter homes again. We need to be able to figure that out. Because by not figuring that out, the starter home industry is taking place in Greene, it's taking place in Fluvanna, it's taking place across the county. And so we are losing sort of what I will say an affiliation with Albemarle County, because the people who come here and start to build their lives here, go someplace else and do that. And so is it my aspiration that I'd want to move back to Albemarle County? I don't think so. But my aspiration will be that I'm going to grow and I'm going to buy a different house wherever it is that I have my starter home. So I think that is a structural problem that we have, particularly if you look at what's being built and the median income on what's being built, median price tag on what's being built, they are not starter homes.
Right.
Another reason I think we need to do that is because we cannot afford to have places that don't have houses in them become large districts. Putting out of balance the districts, so Jack Jewett, Samuel, Whitehall, putting the district structure that we have out of whack. Because they will have to grow land mass in order to keep balances in the representation. So things like that. I think we've thought about, and this is my piece where I get somewhat excited about. I think there's some role for crossroad communities. I think there's some roles in reinvigorating Esmond. I think there's some roles in reinvigorating the path that used to go, that was a highly enlivened from Scottsville to Stanton. There was a turnpike that went from Stanton to Scottsville. Yeah, that's right. You did. That's right. you
I'm
did.
gonna reopen the Toll House.
Well, they know we took away the Toll House. We took away the Toll House didn't last very long because Commonwealth went into that. But the whole idea that there are these historic places that used to be communities that whatever history is has abandoned them. And I think we need to think about how do we, I'm not saying to go in there and pump, 500 houses there, but I'm talking about how do you take a place like Esmond
Mhm.
and enliven it again? How do you take a place like Batesville, which could then support a real community store there instead of this thing that they've been struggling to do for all these years in Batesville, and actually have that be a place where people could do the kind of green grocery sort of model that's there. Now, here's the piece that's going to be ugly about me, and I'm sorry, it's going to be ugly. I've been trying to figure out the viewshed piece on this, on how we do that, because viewshed, the preservation of viewsheds, and I'm not talking about putting up billboards and all that foolishness, but the preservation of viewsheds is definitely an equitable act on the land, and it transfers value to people without the value ever going to the community.
Did you say inequitable?
It's inequitable.
Yes.
For instance, if you're going to tell me that we should do the viewsheds from 1607, when the Constant and the Godspeed and the Susan arrived here, okay, I might be good about that. I might be good, okay, that's when they got here, so let's preserve the viewsheds from that. I'm not going to do 1619. If you're going to talk about when 1744, when Albemarle County became a county, and we're going to preserve the viewsheds from there, I'm good with that too, because then I would immediately remove Monticello. And we wouldn't have to put in the two other presidential houses. I'd be good about that. But the whole idea that we have these things called viewsheds and we don't go back and look at them, that in fact, what we're also doing is preventing anything from being built in front of them, even if it's a modest thing, even if something that would be helpful for the community, but somehow or another, we're passing a good to a group of people. This is part of where I was going with the Mirador thing. It's like, she's not from here, they're not from here, but yet we're going to preserve something and no one can do anything in front of it. And they didn't buy the air rights or the view rights. In some places, if you want to do that, you buy the air rights. Right? And then you say nobody's going to.
There's examples out west where people are paying the rancher to ranch so they can look at the ranch. And the rancher can afford to stay in business.
That's right. So my whole piece is that we have tended to give things out as a community in support of a bunch of activities that I don't think the community, I don't think the broader community is benefiting from. And so if we talk about equity and we talk about green, my whole idea is how do we start to rebalance that? And everybody realize I live in the rural part of the community. So I'm not trying to bust this up just for the sake of busting it up. But I do have to think about when I hear some of the resistance to things, that resistance means that we're basically freezing a set of options for people, for our community. And I just can't sort of sustain that much longer.
Okay, that wasn't as ugly.
It wasn't ugly. Oh,
Yes, but I knew you could only go for 6 minutes.
that's right.
Okay, I'll just tag on to what you said a little bit, and then I have a slightly different point. Yeah, I said this before, so I'm not really going to repeat the whole statement that I've said probably 20 times, which is just that notion that this view of the rural areas is preserved, where we sit on the porch drinking mint juleps and nothing goes on there, and you can't get your oil changed because that's a dirty, ugly thing. We don't do that in the rural area, so. But we do change our oil in the rural area. So anyway, the point is, what is the point? The point is I want to think about the rural areas where people really live and where they need these crossroad communities, where we need to start thinking about some different kind of zoning models. And that's already been inferred in other documents we've had for this. But what I actually want to bring up is just also that notion of centers. This has been a challenge for the planning commission, because to your point earlier about, like we want the developer to come with this complete, like almost like little mini town and plop it down, and it's got to have a commercial center, and we've got those annoying Cs all over our. And they're in weird places, like I think maybe the C was put somewhere strategically initially, but then all the stuff developed, now the C is in a really weird spot, but we're supposed to put a commercial center there, and we have this conversation over and over again, because like, but a half a mile away is a commercial center, but we're gonna tell us, this developer, they should put a commercial center. And I'm not going to name which developments, you can all remember what they are. So, I think we need to get away too from this, as we create this perfect pretend neighborhood, that we think it has to be a complete town, that it should be contextual to where it is. And that we shouldn't shove a commercial center in the middle of every neighborhood, because it doesn't necessarily make sense. So as we write up our aspirations about how you can walk to the local store from every single house, we just need to moderate that a little bit and be more intentional about where we do want centers. And, maybe where they already are and they need some reinvestment, as you said. Ever since Yancey School was tragically closed, the only upside to that is that all these social services through the community's work have been brought down there. There are now classes and yoga and cooking and small business stuff, and all kinds of things are happening there. But that could have happened there before. That could have been after school stuff. There was, so reinvesting in that community is still possible, way beyond just Yancey School. So I'll leave it at that. I don't want to sound like I'm self-serving my community. There are other places like this. Okay.
I'll just add the importance of broadband and defining that vision for an equitable community, since it's so vital to our education needs and work needs and so forth.
So we have 5 minutes left to solve all the comprehensive land questions. Yeah. That's
Give us
because,
more time.
well, I just got this note.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I mean, I have a clock.
Oh, it's from the clerk. Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
So I didn't want to use too much more time, but this seems to be a very important section.
Mhm.
One thing I think is very important to mention, our work in Stormwater Conservation District, we've encountered families in the
Have we
rural
moved
area.
on? Have we moved on?
This is the next section.
No, I just wanted to say one more thing about welcoming equitable.
Okay.
We've encountered families in Albemarle County that had no running water and no septic system. And so if we want to be welcoming, equitable, the first thing is making sure people can continue to live in their houses, particularly in the rural area. Helping, once again, that preservation versus restoration, helping people preserve their older house in the rural area is a way of preserving affordable housing.
Yeah.
And the county has done that. We've
Yeah,
done quite a few projects, but yeah, to say that.
Yeah, and so I think, for example, the county has a current funding program that helps with some of that. We don't have a county septic funding program right now. We don't have that. So I think that those are important things. I think in terms of the comment about the Batesville store, one of the reasons that they struggled was because of lack of septic. Trying to fit the septic on that small area. So we can't just automatically throw.
But I will argue to you as a counterpoint to that, if they had a population that could have supplied the money. So it's all about, if I'm going to invest $50,000 into a new septic system, what's my return on investment going to be and how long is this going to be? But if I'm living in a place that I have a house here or a house there or a house there, or I have vacation homes, which some of those houses have turned into vacation homes, then I'm not going to make that investment because I can't make the money.
But it wasn't even that, there's just not physically space to put it. The other thing was too, remember through past history, Ivy, the reason Ivy was a past growth area, the reason it's no longer a growth area is because it ran out of water. Notably, there are neighborhoods like Peacock Hill that their wells ran dry. So there was a past history of some of these areas, we had development sprawled out further into the rural area. And one of the reasons we backed away from that was because we couldn't supply them water, we couldn't provide them septic.
But we don't have to just take the model that, and this would probably alarm somebody, and I'm sure someone will send a newsletter out tomorrow. But this is what happens when I say things. But I'm not being grandiose, I just get misquoted a lot. Here we go again. But you know, places, we don't have to just say, let us harken back to the historic crossroads, and that can be the place where we grow all these, you know, we can put something in a new place
That's the idea.
where there's adequate traffic access, where there's enough vehicle traffic going by that it could support, you know, Crossroads store, we wouldn't allow that today.
That's right.
And yet that is supplying vital services and office spaces and small business startup space and, you know, but that's not the Albemarle way. That is an
But it
exception.
works. It works.
It works really,
Works.
well. And so I'm just saying that that type of place, which I'm not aware of any violations of septic things or anything there, but maybe there is. You know, that is the type of thing that it's actually helpful because it's condensed things in one spot
That's right.
instead of having them sprinkled all over the place. Anyway, so we're kind of out of time.
No.
No,
That's one general.
I don't mind if we keep talking for another half an hour, but I don't know that we
We'll be
have
totally
it
different time.
broadcast, right?
We can continue for as long as you guys would like to. This is just your scheduled time to eat.
Right, I understand.
And also you all will have to be into Lane by 6 o'clock to start the next meeting.
Go ahead.
Oh,
What?
Oh,
hello?
sorry, Carolyn, we missed that. If you could repeat it.
You all would have to be in Lane a little bit before 6 so we can start the next meeting.
Don't worry, we're well aware.
We can do that.
Okay,
We can do
Okay.
that.
usually eat our sandwich in 10 minutes. So what were you gonna say?
Just wanted to be super practical to get to your questions to make sure we
Yeah.
answer them by the end of this meeting. So my quick question of what is not missing? If you were asked, where does infrastructure and resources fit? Does that fit within these categories? Or is that a separate category? Is it like, does it not belong? That's the one thing that, I mean, there's so many great things in here, so much vision.
Yeah.
But it's gonna take resources and infrastructure. And I just wonder if that should be as upfront as these four are. Maybe not, maybe just a thought. But I would recommend forwarding it to the board of supervisors.
Yes, I would agree with that too.
And I would say that, again, what's missing is things like examples of areas that maybe begin to embody, it may not be perfect. Maybe not be the idyllic world here, you painted, but perhaps they're headed in the right direction, right? So I think picking up on that, you know, of the things that we are doing well already and are fitting into the vision. So I would add that. I think those are important and they may help when this crosswalk goes away to talk about exactly this is what we need. And then I would also not shy away from the things that we're not doing well and then perhaps need a new strategy. You are talking about strategies. Perhaps we need a new strategy in some of these areas. So to me, those are the things that are perhaps missing.
Well, we've had center runner for sandwiches, so you can keep going here.
So we can keep going.
Yes.
I mean, along those same lines, I mean, so if we can talk about some of the how do you deal with the duality of the different areas? I would say, so even staying within this, the connected, accessible, and the thriving and prosperous. So if I look at the whole piece, we have a lot of infrastructure right now that is green, that's park, that's luscious, that's not accessible by the people by the places where you want the people to be. So I can't get to Walnut Creek Park. I can't get the mint green, or is it mint Springs? I can't
You
get
got me
the,
going.
yeah, I can't get the Mint Springs Park from where I live unless I drive.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. I just said, thank you so much. And so the whole idea, if we're trying to provide access and equity to screen spaces, we got to figure that out. You know, people have heard me say, and I ride bikes, and I have bikes at home, but my piece is, I don't care about bicycles. Because bicycles should be under transportation unless you're treating them as a recreation activity. If it's a recreation activity, I get that you separate it out. But when it's being used as transportation, it should be a transportation option. It should not have its own thing. I get it. What I really need, I need sidewalks. I need within the area where I can control people, where I want to put people, I need sidewalks to get them from A to B. I don't need a bicycle trail when I'm trying to get somebody on the sidewalk so that they're not walking in the street. So if I look at that sort of connectivity piece that we're looking at all infrastructure, that to me is a big piece. How do we deal with the executive, and this gets back to Louise, how do we deal with the existing things that we have and improve them in a way that they're measurable? Okay, I can't make the argument, even though I'm fond of them, I can't make the argument of giving me 100-mile bike segmentation, particularly which is going to be most probably in the rural part of our community, is going to have a demonstrative. I can't make that argument. But you give me 100 miles of sidewalk, I can move a whole bunch of people. I can move a whole bunch of people.
And as I pointed out before, there's just a question of funding now. I mean, there is some federal funding, you know, I think especially now for maybe some larger corridors, you know, people are talking about the 3-notch trail. That's an example of something. But generally speaking, we've had a national bike route go through our county, as I mentioned before, and it's a death trap. You know, we can't get bike lanes on a national bike route through Albemarle County. So where it says here in the rural area, there are multimodal options for walking and bicycling that coexist safely with cars and buses. Well, buses in the rural
There are
area.
many buses in the rural area.
So that's a pretty challenging phrase to me. It's very aspirational, if you will. I mean, really, as a rural area resident, I've said before, just don't ruin the areas we have. I mean, the only safe places we have to walk right now are gravel roads, areas where there's low traffic going on. When I grew up in Ivy, we used to be able to walk on Morgantown Road. We used to be able to walk on. I don't know if it's very walkable anymore.
It is. He walks every day.
You do? Okay, well, that's good. So I mean,
Gotta walk before the traffic.
you probably don't walk there like.
He walks at 4 a.m.
So, I mean, I think it's about preserving what we have, do no harm. You know, but I don't get me wrong, I would love to see regional greenways in the rural area, and I do think, but I don't think. How are they funded?
I'll just ask an open question, and also feel free to also tell us things that we haven't answered for you. But I mean, do you feel like in reading this entire document, there was enough emphasis on the need to provide more green space in the urban areas? The idea of the county investing.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I think this is where when we think about and we embrace the conflicts instead of
Right.
not talking about them in conflict. That we're going to have all this development, we're going to have all this identity, we're going to have, and we're going to preserve our historic resources, our natural resources, all great. I mean, nobody's going to disagree with that.
Right.
But we know that inherently there's a talk about solar farms, that well, those are in conflict with agriculture. We're gonna have to deal with that sooner. We're already having to deal with that to some degree. Right? So what's the land, what's the viability of the land? What are we gonna use it for? Should we be using land for energy? It's an important question that we have to deal with, not just that, it's also geotechnical wells, geothermal wells and so forth. So I would, if we embrace these conflicts is where we can begin to think about, well, we can add green, we can add agriculture to the urban, and there are different layers of that urban sector, right? As we'll be talking about. There's ways of doing that. There's people that have gardens in the city. And so how we begin to think about that qualitatively and as well as quantitatively, I think is how we can perhaps begin to grapple with these conflicts. I don't think it has to be either or. I don't know that I have the answer either, but starting the dialogue is what I think is important. That's why not washing over these conflicts like you said, there's a lot of, you know, there's potentially different agendas, there's different, I like your term, you used, what was it? What is that for? You said, like VDOT and what did you call them?
Oh, service provider?
Service providers, but then you changed to partners.
Yeah.
And I think that's important as we think about how we connect with our service providers as partners.
Mhm.
And you know, and other, you know, how, again, the question of how broadly are we disseminating all this, but I think it's the more people that are involved and the more thoughts that come to play, ideas and diversity of thought, is when we can get to some of these solutions to the conflicts, because I do think that they're manageable. I do think that there's ways to deal with what may seem as two things that are opposing forces.
So, you know, if I could come, so, you know, money often can slide you through a bunch of conflict. But here's my problem on that. So this comes as thriving and prosperous community. So I went and looked at the BLS data, the Bureau of Labor Supply, labor, you know, statistics for this area. And the median wage here is $59,000. Because I'm trying to think, how can we generate taxes? You know, so I'm looking at, are we a place that can actually generate that actually can have an impact on the tax base, because this is going to cost money. And how do you, where are you going to get the money from? And sort of what's our labor market look like? You know, that kind of stuff. So we can, and
That's household too. That's not just individual.
well,
Yeah.
no, that's employees. No, that's not household. I'm looking at a job in Albemarle in the Charlottesville Metropolitan Statistical.
So that area.
I thought the median for the county was 95,000.
So that might be,
That's
this is for job.
Yeah, okay.
This is for job.
Okay.
So the job is 59. The other one, you said, what were the top three occupations here? So some of them make sense, but the top occupation in our area, office and admin support for 12,000 people being employed at that at a mean salary, mean wage of 41,000. So that's even below the mean wage for the area. You know, you think that the healthcare practitioners and sort of educate the post-secondary education, yeah, they're making their median wages in like in the 80s. So, but my piece was, where are we going to get the money to do this? Since we tend to be a community that resists any opportunity for the supervisors to raise taxes in any shape or form. Because all the stuff that we're talking about, whether or not it's correcting this and putting this here, or putting in a public works department, because the moment you start talking about green spaces that aren't maintained by the developer, we've got to have somebody who, you know, who pays for these things. Where's the money going to come from? In a place that most of the industry is being dealt from soft, or I will say soft industries. They're not manufactured, they're not doing this, but they're basically supporting the three big entities around you. Local government, meaning the school system, medical profession, and the university. So that's like the big conflict in my head. It's like, where do we get the money to do these things that I think we want to do? What's it say?
Thriving and prosperous.
That's the one. That's the one that pushed me there.
Have you read the first?
Yeah, that's what pushed me there. I couldn't see I don't see where you get the money. Huh?
That's how you get there.
I read that. And I said, I don't see how you get the money. I mean, I really did. I wrestled with this whole thing.
You know, again, I think that's where examples. So what are things that we're doing well? What are some economies,
Right.
that are working here? There are some conversations for some new industries that are coming in the area that we may be well positioned for.
Right.
And so again, this is a vision for the future. We get it. I mean, this is what, 22 years away. And so there are opportunities. I think our job is, how do we create the land use to incentivize and, you know, with all these value systems that we're putting in, how can we still incentivize some of these industries to come here? Right, so there's a, you know, I mean, you guys have probably all heard and read the biotech corridor, right, from Richmond to
Washington. To Washington.
no, it's actually from Richmond to Blacksburg or to
Oh, yeah.
Roanoke. Thank you.
Roanoke.
Richmond to Roanoke, and we're right in the middle of that. And we have some resources here, so there's some opportunities. And I think that is how we get there. The question is the land use. And how do we begin to think about the land use? And I really like that your process of preservation versus restoration. I think that is a very good concept. It's a simplified way of thinking about it, but I think it's such a good way.
We have about, just to say, we have about 5 minutes left before we need to actually go, I'll go because staff have to transition themselves. And shut down things and turn things on and all that. I will also say, I just want to add in terms of business and incentives and things like that. I mean, I keep also bringing up that idea of the entrepreneur. And the entrepreneur does not usually start their startup with 10 people. Good luck if they can, but it's not usually 10 people showing up for the first day of work. It's 1 and 2 and 3, and then so on and so forth. And then they may stop at 10, and that might be their business model. They're not on their way to 500. And, we have, in my mind, not just in my mind, in fact, very draconian rules for businesses out of your house. Like I ran a mediation business, but I didn't mediate for anyone in this county. I had clients that were federal government. I went to Colorado to mediate court cases. So I didn't do anything in my house, but I was even told by someone in the county, I won't name, who said, don't bother trying to get a small business license for your house. They have to do, make sure that clients can visit you and they have to look it up, and it just became so silly because it was me on a laptop. I could have fit in a phone booth, the whole business, so. And then people are worried about, paying for their desk and their chair and their business tax on their rug. And I mean, it just seems like Charlottesville is much more lenient with those kind of small business things. So if we want to try to foster that, we need to not only make it easier for someone to have a home-based business, whether or not, a lot of businesses do not have clients coming to them. We have this sort of weird old-fashioned model. I mean, look at teleworking. So I think that we need to think about those various micro businesses, and then that next step up where they need a space for 5 people. In talking to economic development, they're really not set up. That they're really set up to try to bring a big bunch of factory jobs here, which we haven't got a lot of flat land. So that's not going to be the way.
Or the new intellectual property.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's where. I
Oh,
think
sure,
that's-
biotech, great. I'm not against biotech, but
There's
that
a lot
would
of
not be our
intellectual-
sole business model. The board did a economic development plan. The board hired it out. I thought it was pretty poor, frankly. And, they just had really broad categories like food. Food is a thing.
That's one of them.
It was so vague. And then remember when beer was food.
That's a long time ago. yeah.
Yes, that was an argument that was
That
made.
was a long time.
Can't get over it.
Yeah.
But and it was like tourism, food, I can't remember the other 2. I mean, it was just so vague. And there was no infrastructure behind that, whether it was human infrastructure or physical infrastructure, just to foster any of that to grow here. So let's take 1 or 2 comments, then we gotta let staff turn off the mics.
Let's have go.
Super.
Staff.
So my friend Dan has often mentioned that there are so many waste opportunities with developing recreation-based economy in Elmont County. Just went to Luray recently to run a race. We spent a lot of money just on the race tickets themselves. We ate at 3 different restaurants. We rented a cabin. We went to Luray Caverns, went to the gift shop where my kids had to buy stuff. Luray has a bunch of my money right because they had a race. So I think that there's a really big opportunity for recreation-based economy that we're not really looking at in terms of economic development, but we really should.
Yeah.
And talk about a race with 1,000 people, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, there are a lot of opportunities in that. Do you want to say a quick comment and then we'll?
Super quick. This is great work. I think, it's a framework, right? So we're talking.
Somewhere to
about how it's
start.
So idyllic, but when we were taught in school, right, start with the ideal, because where you end up will be much better if you start with it. So I think you've done that. I think I would hope that as a county, at the end of this, we're being honest with ourselves. Right? So
Yeah, 'cause if we
sure,
found
it's great that we've
Too
got. the idea,
ideally
but-
may sound fake.
And so I think there should be a time where after we get through all the policy stuff and we get to the point where we have action plans, et cetera, that we stop and look back at these and go, you know what? We just can't make that
Yeah,
work.
that one was the proposal.
Yep. But here's what we can do. And there's that chance to check.
Yeah, that's a good way to,
And
that's a good ending comment.
And if it wasn't good, you wouldn't have gotten all this conversation out of it.
Yes.
So you should
Right.
also realize.
We're adjourned in 30 minutes. Our meeting's adjourned.
Substantial enough for comment.
Yes,
Thank you all.
yeah,
It is good
somebody
work.
has to
Thank
do the work, so
Yes.
thank you.
Right.
All right, so we're in recess for 10 minutes, or 9 minutes and 8 seconds, and then you'll be back on the